There are moments in life that don't scream for your attention. They just slip quietly into the background, like a familiar song playing low on the radio while you drive the same roads you've driven for years. My marriage felt a bit like that song. Comfortable, predictable, a steady rhythm I could hum along to without thinking. We weren't unhappy, at least not in any way that would raise eyebrows. We had the house we wanted, the little rituals that held our days together. Dinners at 7, his hand always resting gently on my lower back when we walked into a room. Smiles that looked good in pictures. But underneath the surface of all that symmetry, there was something missing. Not love, not respect. He was a good man, always had been. But the physical space between us had quietly widened over the years, like a seam splitting open thread by thread. The touches had become polite, the kisses brief. There was no hunger left in them, no spark that made me feel like more than just the woman he shared bills and plans with. I began to feel invisible in my own skin. I told myself not to make a problem where there wasn't one. After all, how many women could say they had a kind, faithful husband? And yet, some days, standing in front of the mirror, adjusting a dress that clung softly to my hips, I caught my own eyes and wondered how long I could keep ignoring the quiet ache inside me. The need to feel wanted. Really wanted. It was during one of those slow, steady Sundays that he mentioned his nephew was coming back into town. The words barely registered at first. Just background noise between sips of coffee and folding the laundry. He's finally done with that job up north, my husband said, not looking up from his phone. Thought it might be nice to invite him over for dinner. I nodded without much thought. The nephew, I'd known him since he was a teenager, all lanky limbs and careless grins, running barefoot through our house every summer. In my mind, he was still that boy, the one who laughed too loud and always asked for seconds at the table. The evening came faster than I expected. I didn't put on anything special, just a soft cream-colored blouse and fitted pants. Comfortable but neat. I wasn't dressing for anyone but myself. At least that's what I told myself as I lingered a bit too long choosing earrings, opting for the simple gold hoops he had once complimented. When the doorbell rang, I was in the kitchen, arranging the salad. My husband called out a greeting, his voice warm, familiar, steady. I heard the front door open, the shuffle of shoes on the mat, the low thrum of male voices exchanging casual hellos. And then I saw him. Gone was the awkward boy I remembered. In his place stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, his movements unhurried and self-assured. His jaw was sharper, his eyes darker, and when he smiled, there was a quiet confidence in it that hadn't been there before. He had the look of someone who had stumbled, maybe fallen, but learned how to stand taller because of it. "Wow," he said as he stepped into the kitchen, eyes locking onto mine. "You haven't changed a bit." I smiled back, automatic, polite. "That's kind of you to say, but I'm sure I have." His gaze didn't drop. He held it, just long enough that I felt the tiniest flutter beneath my ribs. And I hated myself for noticing. Dinner was uneventful on the surface. The conversation flowed easily between the two men, catching up on work, sports, harmless stories. I listened, smiling where I should, nodding at the right moments, but my attention kept drifting back to him. The way he leaned back in the chair, one arm resting casually along the backrest, his fingers tapping thoughtfully against the wood. His eyes would meet mine across the table, and there was something in them that felt deliberate. Not flirtatious. No, that would have been too obvious. It was more like curiosity, like he was studying me. At one point, my husband excused himself to take a phone call in the other room. The silence between us stretched for a moment before the nephew tilted his head slightly and asked, "So, how have you been?" There was nothing remarkable about the question. The words were innocent enough. But the way he said it, soft, intentional, made me feel exposed. I looked down at my glass of wine, swirling it slowly, giving myself a second too long to answer. "Good," I said finally. "We're good." His lips curled at the corner, a barely there smirk that felt like he knew I was lying. or at least not telling the full truth. The conversation picked up again when my husband returned, and just like that, the moment passed. But the seed had already been planted. I felt it growing inside me as the evening wore on, a restless, pulsing awareness I hadn't felt in years. When he stood to leave, he offered the same warm smile, the same casual goodbye. But as he leaned forward to kiss my cheek, nothing unusual, nothing inappropriate. His hand brushed lightly against my waist. Not long enough to be noticed by anyone else, but long enough that I felt it. Long enough to know it wasn't an accident. I watched him walk out the door, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt my own heart race in my chest. It wasn't love. It wasn't even attraction. Not yet. It was something far more dangerous. It was attention. I spent the next few days convincing myself that I had imagined it, that the touch of his hand against my waist was nothing more than a polite gesture, the kind of fleeting contact family members share without a second thought. I repeated it in my head like a mantra, the way you say something out loud enough times to make it sound true. But my body told me otherwise. The memory of it stayed, tucked beneath my skin like a warm ember refusing to die out. Life, on the surface, rolled on predictably. My husband remained his usual self, kind, steady, gentle in all the ways that counted. Every morning he kissed my forehead before leaving for work. Every evening he asked about my day while I plated dinner. There were no fights, no raised voices, nothing that would suggest a crack beneath the polished surface of our life together. And yet there I was, standing longer than necessary in front of the mirror each morning, my fingertips grazing the soft lace of my underwear, choosing colors I hadn't bothered to wear in years. Not for him. For me. Or so I told myself. The invitation to help in the garden came casually, almost as an afterthought. My husband mentioned it over breakfast, his voice calm, oblivious. The back fence needed mending. A few of the roses had overgrown and the trellis was beginning to lean. He was tied up with work all week. His nephew, though, had offered to lend a hand. He said he doesn't mind stopping by to help you with it, my husband added, buttering his toast without looking up. I nodded, too quickly. That's nice of him. Yeah, he's a good kid. My husband smiled. A good kid. The words echoed in my head as I smoothed my skirt down over my hips that afternoon, my palms moving slowly across the soft fabric. I told myself not to read into it, not to overthink. This was family. Helping with the garden. Nothing more. But I chose the white linen blouse that clung just enough at the waist to suggest shape without trying too hard. I left the top 2 buttons undone, the faint hint of the satin edge of my bra visible if I leaned the wrong way. I didn't plan it that way. Or maybe I did. When the knock came at the back door, I felt the ridiculous flutter of nerves again, the same racing in my chest I hadn't felt since my early 20s. I opened the door and there he stood, dressed simply. Jeans, a plain t-shirt, his hair pushed back carelessly with one hand. Effortless. Completely at ease. Hey, he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Your husband told me you could use an extra pair of hands. I managed a smile, nodding toward the yard. The trellis is a mess. I appreciate the help. We walked outside together, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lawn. I felt the heat of the day sink into my skin, making the light fabric of my blouse cling just a bit closer. He followed me toward the back fence, his stride relaxed, his hands casually stuffed into his pockets. You always keep the place looking this good? He asked, glancing around the garden. I try, I answered, pulling my hair up off my neck, feeling the sweat bead along my collarbone. We worked in silence for a while, the air filled with the sounds of summer, birds, the faint buzz of distant lawnmowers, the creak of wood as he hammered the trellis back into place. Every so often, our arms brushed as we maneuvered around each other in the tight space. Each time it happened, my breath caught. Stupidly, like I was some girl who'd never felt the weight of a man's gaze before. I remember running through here when I was a kid. he said at one point, stepping back to admire the fixed frame. Used to drive your husband crazy. Said I trampled half the garden. I smiled at the memory. You did. His eyes met mine then, the corner of his mouth curling up slightly. You were always the one who let me off easy. The moment hung there between us, fragile and dangerous. I turned away, reaching for the watering can, desperate for something to do with my hands. But he was already moving closer, stepping into my space, his voice dropping lower. You look really good, you know, he said quietly. I froze, my fingers tightening involuntarily around the metal handle. Don't, I whispered, though I didn't step back. Why not? His tone wasn't cocky. It wasn't a tease. It was curious. Honest. You feel it too. The watering can slipped from my grasp, hitting the ground with a dull thud. His hand moved to my wrist, light but deliberate, stopping me from bending to pick it up. His fingers stayed there, wrapped around the inside of my arm, warm and sure. This is wrong, I said, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. But my body betrayed me. I didn't pull away. My heart was pounding too loud, drowning out the warning bells. You don't believe that, he replied, stepping closer. Close enough that I could feel the heat of him, the faint scent of soap and sweat and something unmistakably male. I should have walked away. I should have laughed it off, turned my back, called my husband, done any of the 100 things a sane woman would do in that moment. But when his lips brushed mine, soft at first, testing, I didn't move. I didn't resist. I let it happen. The kiss was quick, almost cautious, but beneath it I felt the tension, the electricity we'd both been pretending not to notice. When he pulled back, just slightly, his eyes searched mine, waiting for the slap, the scream, the anger. Instead, I stood there, breathless, my lips parted, my skin humming. He stepped back first, releasing my wrist slowly, his hand trailing down my forearm as if reluctant to let go. I'll come by tomorrow to finish the fence, he said, his voice even again, like nothing had happened. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I only watched him walk away, knowing with terrifying certainty that I wanted him to come back. I didn't sleep that night. Not in any way that counted. I lay in bed beside my husband, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, the rise and fall of his chest, the soft rustle of the sheets each time he turned in his sleep. I stared at the ceiling for hours, my body still holding on to the imprint of a kiss I had no business allowing. My lips felt as though they still carried the heat of it, the memory of pressure, of hesitation, of invitation. The guilt should have crushed me right there. I waited for it to come, for the sick weight of shame to settle into my chest and make me recoil from the thought of him. But what came instead was a different ache, one that had been sleeping inside me for years. The slow, unbearable hunger of being noticed, of being seen not as a wife, not as a partner in daily life, but as a woman. A woman who could still make someone's gaze linger, someone's pulse quicken. I turned my head on the pillow and watched my husband's face in the pale glow of the moonlight slipping between the curtains. I tried to remember the last time he'd looked at me the way his nephew had looked at me that afternoon. Not with obligation, not with gratitude, but with want. I counted backward through the months, through the years. I couldn't put my finger on a moment. There had been affection, yes, familiarity, kindness, the sort of gentle, responsible love that the world tells you should be enough. And maybe it was for him, but I felt myself slipping further and further away from that version of myself, the version content with polite touches and soft kisses that never pressed too deep. I felt like a photograph left too long in the sun, fading at the edges, losing color where there had once been so much brightness. The next morning, I moved through my routine on autopilot. Coffee, breakfast, a kiss on the cheek from my husband as he headed out the door, brief and perfunctory. I stood by the window after he left, the mug warm between my palms, staring out at the garden where the trellis stood half repaired. I should have canceled. I should have picked up the phone and told him not to come back. But my hands stayed still, the words unspoken. Instead, I found myself upstairs, standing in front of my closet longer than I wanted to admit, my fingers grazing over the fabrics as if they could decide for me. It wasn't about seduction, not entirely. It was about feeling alive inside my own skin again. I chose a simple summer dress, soft blue cotton, the straps thin and delicate across my shoulders. Modest enough, but the cut of it traced the line of my waist in a way that felt almost intimate. I didn't put on perfume, but I let my hair down, loose waves falling along my collarbone. I told myself it didn't mean anything. When the doorbell rang, the sound felt louder than usual, cutting through the quiet of the house like a blade. I moved to answer it, my heart already racing in my chest, faster than I wanted to admit. He stood there, one hand on his hip, the other holding a small toolbox, casual as anything. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "Morning," he said finally, his voice steady. I stepped aside to let him in, my hand smoothing the skirt of my dress out of nervous habit. "Coffee?" I offered, my voice quieter than I intended. He nodded once. "Sure." In the kitchen, I busied myself with the ritual of pouring coffee, grateful for the distraction of movement, the clink of the mugs, the gentle pour of liquid, the steam rising between us. When I turned to hand him the cup, his fingers brushed mine as he took it, lingering just a second longer than necessary. My skin burned where he touched me. We moved out into the garden without another word about the day before. He worked in silence, methodical, focused on the task at hand. I hovered nearby, pretending to tidy up the flower beds, my hands shaking slightly every time I reached down to pull a weed. I could feel the weight of his presence beside me, could feel his gaze shift toward me when he thought I wasn't looking. There was a charge in the air between us, thick and undeniable, a current running just beneath the surface of our every movement. At one point, reaching for the hammer, his hand met mine on the handle. Neither of us pulled away immediately. Our fingers stayed there, tangled together, holding on to the excuse of the shared task for just a moment too long. "You didn't say anything yesterday," he said, his voice low. I didn't know what to say. I answered, my throat tight. He looked at me then. Really looked, his eyes searching mine for something more than words. "You didn't stop me." I swallowed hard, my hand still on the handle of the hammer. "I should have." "But you didn't," he replied, not as accusation, but as fact. The silence between us held everything we weren't saying, everything we knew we shouldn't be feeling. He stepped back first, returning to the trellis, his focus shifting back to the work. I turned away, my hands trembling as I dug my fingers into the soil, willing the earth to ground me. But the damage had already been done. The line had been crossed. Not fully. Not yet. But enough. The rest of the afternoon passed in strained quiet, broken only by the sounds of tools, of wood creaking back into place, of the occasional bird calling overhead. And beneath it all, the steady thrum of something neither of us could deny. When he finished, he wiped his hands on the back of his jeans and turned to me, the faintest smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "I'll be around," he said simply. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. When the door closed behind him, I pressed my palms flat against the kitchen counter, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew it then. This wasn't going to go away. The strange thing about desire is how easily it weaves itself into the spaces of your everyday life, slipping into moments where it has no business being. It doesn't announce itself with grand gestures or dramatic ultimatums. It settles into the quiet, into the routine. It lingers in the way your hands move when you stir sugar into your coffee, in the pause before you answer a simple question, in the beat your heart skips when you hear the sound of the doorbell. The days after that afternoon became a balancing act between what I knew was right and what my body was already craving without permission. I moved through my home with practiced grace, folding laundry, answering emails, preparing dinners, all while carrying the weight of something unspoken. My husband remained unaware, or perhaps simply unwilling to notice the subtle shift in my attention, the new current running beneath my skin. It was during one of those evenings, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, that I caught myself watching the way he chewed his food, the soft, absent-minded gestures of a man settled comfortably into habit. His eyes met mine across the table, warm, content, oblivious. He smiled. I smiled back. But there was a flicker inside me, a restless tapping at the edge of my thoughts that wouldn't quiet down. I should have been ashamed of that flicker, but I wasn't. Not fully. Not yet. The next time I saw his nephew was at the end of the week, at the small market 2 blocks from our house. A coincidence, at least on the surface. I had walked there for no real reason. The pantry was full enough, the list in my hand more excuse than necessity. The air smelled of peaches and cut grass, the late summer heat pressing against my skin as I moved slowly between the rows of fruit stands and flower stalls. I felt him before I saw him. That sounds dramatic, I know. But it's true. There was a tension, a pull, like the air had shifted just slightly around me. When I turned, there he was, leaning casually against the side of one of the produce tables, one hand tucked into the pocket of his jeans, the other turning an apple over in his palm as if he had all the time in the world. Our eyes met, and in that moment, the rest of the street seemed to fade into soft blur. "Hey," he said, his voice carrying the same easy tone he always used. "Fancy seeing you here." I answered with something safe, something neutral. I don't even remember the words. They didn't matter. What mattered was the way his gaze didn't drop, the way his eyes traced the line of my throat, the curve of my shoulder beneath the strap of my dress. It was the same dress I'd worn the last time. I hadn't planned it. But standing there, feeling the weight of his stare, I couldn't pretend it was just a coincidence. We talked briefly, casually, about nothing, the weather, the produce, all the filler that keeps conversations polite, appropriate. But beneath every word was the same undeniable undercurrent that had hung between us since the first time his lips touched mine. As I turned to leave, ready to put distance between us, he stepped closer, his voice lowering just enough that it belonged only to me. "You're not sleeping," he said, not as a question. I paused, my back still half turned toward him, my fingers tightening around the handle of my shopping bag. The truth of it stung more than I wanted to admit. But I didn't correct him. I didn't deny it. Instead, I walked away, my heart hammering against my ribs. That night, back home, my husband suggested we spend the weekend at his sister's house, a family get-together, nothing unusual. His nephew would be there, of course. Everyone would. Another warm summer evening with too much food, too much laughter, the easy comfort of familiar faces gathered in one place. I said yes before I could think too hard about it. The next afternoon, as I packed an overnight bag, I felt my hands shaking again. Not from guilt, from anticipation. I hated myself for it. Hated the way my thoughts drifted to him so easily now. How my body seemed to react at the very idea of being near him again. I chose my clothes carefully, but not obviously. A soft knit top, snug enough to remind myself of the shape beneath it. A skirt that grazed my knees when I walked, but caught the air just enough to feel light against my skin. Underneath, lace. Black. Simple, but deliberate. Not for my husband. Not for anyone but me. But I knew whose eyes I hoped might notice. The house was busy when we arrived. Laughter drifted from the backyard. Glasses clinked. Conversations overlapped. I smiled where I was supposed to. Hugged relatives, accepted compliments on my hair, my dress, my cooking. I played my part well. He was there, of course. Moving easily through the crowd, comfortable, charming. He didn't seek me out immediately, and I was grateful for that. But his eyes found me once, twice, lingering just long enough each time to leave my skin buzzing. The hours passed in a blur of polite conversation and half-finished drinks. The sun dipped lower. the light softening into that golden haze that makes everything look just a little more forgiving, a little more beautiful. It wasn't until much later, when the group began to thin, when the noise faded into softer pockets of conversation, that he approached me again. We stood near the back of the garden, just far enough from the others, close enough to be overheard if either of us forgot ourselves. "You shouldn't look at me the way you do," he said quietly, eyes fixed on mine. I forced a smile, shaking my head slightly, keeping my voice calm. "I'm not looking at you any particular way." "You are," he answered, stepping half a pace closer, just enough to feel the space tighten between us. "And I like it." The words hit me square in the chest. No charm, no teasing smile. Just honesty. Raw and simple. I didn't respond. I couldn't. But I didn't move away either. Later, long after the last guests had left, I lay awake in the guest room, listening to the soft creaks of the old house settling around me. My husband breathed evenly beside me, lost to sleep, peaceful as ever. I stared at the ceiling, the weight of his nephew's gaze still burning beneath my skin. We hadn't touched that night. Not once. And somehow that felt even worse. There are silences that weigh more than words ever could. The kind of silences that sit between two people like a third presence in the room, breathing alongside them, filling the spaces where conversation should go. That night in the guest room, lying beside my husband, I felt that silence pressing down on my chest, squeezing the air out of me as I stared at the ceiling and listened to the slow, steady cadence of his sleep. I turned my head toward him once, watched the peaceful slack of his face and the soft light from the hallway filtering through the crack in the door. He looked so trusting, so sure of the life we shared. And in that moment, I felt like a thief. But I didn't cry. There were no tears to soften the edges of what I felt. Only the quiet, gnawing ache of knowing I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't turn away from. The next morning came too easily. Breakfast at the long wooden table, surrounded by family chatter and the clink of silverware on plates. I smiled, I nodded. I answered questions about work, about the garden, about the book I'd said I was reading. I poured coffee. I passed the butter. I did all the things expected of me. He sat across the table, 3 seats down, his posture loose, his attention seemingly caught in the conversation about a recent football game. But every now and then, his eyes would slide toward me, just briefly, just enough to let me know he was still there, tuned into the same quiet frequency neither of us dared to speak aloud. It was my husband who suggested we take the afternoon to walk through the nearby vineyard. It had been years since the family visited it together, and the weather was perfect for it. Warm, breezy, the sky that soft blue that feels almost painted. I agreed too quickly, too easily. The vineyard stretched wide along the hills just outside of town, rows of vines weaving neat lines across the gentle slopes, the earth dry beneath our feet. We walked together as a group at first, but like these things often go, we drifted into smaller pairs, conversation pulling people into different pockets of space. I found myself walking alone for a while, trailing behind the others, letting the distance give me a moment to breathe. Or at least, that's what I told myself. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. "You're avoiding me," he said, his voice quiet but certain as he fell into step beside me. "I'm walking," I replied, keeping my gaze ahead. "That's not what I asked." I sighed, my arms folding loosely across my chest. "What do you want me to say?" "The truth," he answered, his eyes locked on my profile. "For once." I stopped walking then, turning toward him, frustration prickling at the edges of my control. "And what truth is that?" "That I can't stop thinking about you? That I hate myself for it? That I replay that kiss over and over in my head every night since it happened?" The words tumbled out of me before I could stop them, raw and louder than I intended. My voice caught at the end, breathless, my chest tightening beneath the weight of them. His expression didn't shift. There was no smugness, no victory in his eyes, only something softer, something almost like relief. I'm not sorry, he said, stepping closer, his voice lower now. For me alone. I won't apologize for wanting you. I shook my head, my hands trembling where they gripped my arms. You should. But I don't. He leaned in just slightly, enough that I could feel the heat of him, the subtle rise and fall of his breath. And neither do you. I stood there, frozen, caught between the pull of him and the voice in my head screaming for me to run. But I didn't move. I didn't step away. I didn't even try. Instead, I felt my body leaning into the gravity of his, the space between us dissolving until there was only the warmth of his palm grazing the curve of my jaw, his fingers sliding just beneath my chin as he tilted my face up toward his. The kiss that followed wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was slow, deliberate, filled with the weight of everything we hadn't said, everything we had been trying not to feel. His lips were firm against mine, but gentle, as if asking permission even as he took what he wanted. And I gave it. I kissed him back. Fully. Without hesitation this time. Without the excuse of surprise or confusion. My hands lifted almost instinctively, fingers threading into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer, anchoring myself to the moment like I knew I would drown if I let go. The vineyard stretched quietly around us, the soft rustle of wind moving through the vines, the hum of insects in the afternoon heat. Somewhere in the distance, I could still hear the faint voices of our family, laughing, talking, oblivious. But here, in this pocket of sunlit silence, there was only him. Only the taste of his mouth on mine, the press of his body close enough that I could feel the tension in his muscles, the restrained want beneath the surface. When we finally broke apart, my breath came in shallow gasps, my heart racing so loud I wondered if he could hear it. This is a mistake, I whispered, though my hands still clung to him, fingers curling into the fabric at his waist. Maybe, he answered, his forehead resting briefly against mine. But you don't want to stop? I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because the truth, the awful, beautiful truth, was that he was right. There's a kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from the weight of carrying something you're too afraid to name. That's what the drive home felt like. Sitting in the passenger seat beside my husband, the sun low on the horizon, the gentle hum of the car engine filling the silence between us, I felt it pressing against my chest, heavy and relentless. He was talking about something. The vineyard, the weather, his plans for the coming week, and I nodded in all the right places, smiled when I should have. But my mind was somewhere else entirely. I kept replaying the kiss in my head, every angle of it, every tiny detail. The way his hands had framed my face. The steadiness in his touch, not the grasp of someone reckless, but of someone certain. The heat that spread through me like a slow burn, filling every hollow space I thought I had long since buried. The car rolled along familiar roads, back to the life I was supposed to want, back to the man who had never given me a reason to doubt him. And yet there I was, doubting myself so fully that it felt like betrayal every time I glanced at his profile from the corner of my eye. His hand rested casually on the steering wheel, the other on the gear shift, and I watched the small, habitual movements of his fingers. I had memorized this man. Every curve of his smile, every tone of his laugh. I had built a life around those details. But my body had learned something new. And I couldn't unlearn it now. That evening, back at home, I moved through the motions like muscle memory. Bags unpacked, laundry sorted, leftovers from the trip stored away neatly in the fridge. I set the table for dinner even though neither of us was particularly hungry. Routine had always been the glue of our life together, the quiet agreements we never had to speak aloud. But routine couldn't hold back the flood of what I felt. He poured the wine. We sat across from each other at the table. The conversation felt lighter than it should have, as if neither of us wanted to admit how far away my thoughts had drifted. He asked about the garden again, about whether I wanted him to fix the last of the trellis himself this week, or if I thought his nephew would be stopping by to finish the job. That question landed sharper than he intended, though his tone was casual, unassuming. I don't know if he meant anything by it, or if it was simply a husband being practical, thoughtful. But my stomach tightened at the mention of him, at the unknowing that hung inside the words. "I think he'll be by," I answered, my voice steady despite the pulse racing at my throat. My husband nodded, satisfied with the answer, lifting his glass to his lips, unaware of the storm inside me. That night, in bed, he reached for me. It wasn't often that he did anymore. Not out of neglect or disinterest, but comfort, habit, perhaps the slow fading of passion that happens when people believe they already have each other. But tonight, maybe because of the trip, maybe because of the easy mood of the evening, his hand found my hip beneath the covers, fingers tracing the familiar path along my waist, sliding up toward my ribcage. I stayed still, my breath shallow, my body caught between memory and reality. His lips found my shoulder, soft, tender. He kissed the line where my neck met my collarbone, and I tried, to let myself feel the warmth of it, to respond the way I used to, the way I knew I should. But all I could feel was the absence of heat where I had felt it so intensely only hours before. My skin remembered too well the weight of another mouth, the press of different hands. I turned toward him, offering what I could, willing my body to follow the script we had written over the years. But it was mechanical, an echo of what had once been real. His hands moved over me with care, with love, but I felt like I wasn't there. Like I was watching from somewhere outside myself, waiting for the ache between my thighs to match the ache in my chest. He kissed me, gentle and familiar, the kind of kiss that asks nothing, demands nothing. But I wanted to be demanded. I wanted to be undone. I closed my eyes, and in the darkness I saw the vineyard. I felt the sun on my skin, the press of rough denim against my fingertips, the weight of a gaze that didn't just look at me but saw me. I bit down hard on the inside of my lip, forcing the image away, forcing myself to be present, to give him what he asked for without asking. It didn't take long. It never did with him. Efficiency wrapped in kindness. Love marked by routine. When he finished, he kissed my forehead, the same way he always did, and whispered, "I love you." I swallowed the lump rising in my throat, smiled softly into the dark. "I love you too," I whispered back. But the words tasted hollow. As he drifted into sleep beside me, his breathing steady once more, I lay awake staring at the ceiling again, counting the beats of my own heart, feeling the weight of the lie settle deeper into my bones. It wasn't that he didn't love me. It wasn't even that I didn't love him. It was that I had tasted something else. And now I couldn't pretend I hadn't. It's strange how quickly a line, once crossed, begins to disappear behind you. How easily the mind adjusts, finds ways to explain, to justify, to soften the sharpness of what should feel like betrayal. I thought for a moment that the kiss at the vineyard would be the peak of it, that the shame I felt afterward would be enough to keep me from leaning further into the hunger. But shame, I was learning, is not a reliable guard against want. Sometimes it feeds it. The days that followed passed with a painful slowness. Every routine action felt like I was moving through water, my body heavy with the effort of pretending that the touch of my husband's hand didn't make my skin tense instead of relax, pretending that my smile was easy, that my head wasn't full of every look, every word his nephew had given me. I stayed busy. Too busy. I scrubbed the kitchen floor, though it was already clean, rearranged the linen closet, clipped every dying bloom from the garden as if pruning away the evidence of my restlessness could somehow quiet the ache in my body. But nothing dulled it. He didn't come by to finish the fence. Not right away. 3 days passed, then 4. And with every day that he didn't show up, the need inside me grew louder, sharper. I told myself I was relieved, that the distance was what I needed. But the truth was, I was counting the hours, waiting for the doorbell, listening for his voice outside the window. It was a Thursday afternoon when I finally saw him again. I had walked into town for no good reason, wandering through the small streets lined with cafes and shops, trying to outrun the pacing of my own thoughts. The air was thick with summer heat, the kind that makes the skin beneath your clothes feel too tight. I stopped for an iced coffee, sitting alone at one of the little metal tables outside, watching the slow drift of people passing by. He was across the street before I noticed him. Leaning against the brick wall near the bookstore, one foot propped casually behind him, arms crossed over his chest. His gaze was steady, watching me the way you watch something that doesn't know it's being observed. When our eyes met, neither of us looked away. I felt the heat rise up the back of my neck, my fingers tightening around the plastic cup, the condensation slick against my palm. He didn't move, didn't gesture. He just waited. It was me who stood first, me who crossed the street. The words we shared were few. A quiet, "Hey," from him, a nod from me. The tension between us thick enough to drown in. We walked without saying where we were going, past the bakery, the pharmacy, the edge of the square, our footsteps falling into a natural rhythm, side by side. It wasn't until we reached the small park at the edge of town that either of us spoke again. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low. I shook my head slowly, eyes on the ground. "I've been trying." His laugh was soft, humorless. "How's that working out for you?" I didn't answer. The park was nearly empty, the midday heat keeping most people indoors. We found a shaded bench beneath one of the sprawling oak trees, its branches casting dappled patterns across the ground. We sat at opposite ends, the distance between us deliberate, measured. But the space felt charged, alive with everything we weren't saying. I thought maybe, he started, then stopped, dragging a hand through his hair. "Maybe it scared you off." "It should have," I replied quietly. But it didn't. I looked at him then, fully, my eyes meeting his without the safety of distraction. It didn't. There was a moment, then, a pause so long it felt like the earth itself might be holding its breath. "You know this won't stop," he said finally. And I knew he was right. Every part of me knew it. The ache that lived beneath my ribs, the longing that sparked at the base of my spine every time I thought of him. None of it was going to go away just because I wanted it to. If anything, the effort to ignore it had only made it stronger. I stood, my hands clenched at my sides, the decision already made somewhere inside me before I could talk myself out of it. "I have errands," I lied, my voice softer than I intended. "I should go." He didn't argue. He didn't follow. But as I turned, as I walked away from him again, I felt his eyes on my back the entire time. That evening, the house was quiet when my husband returned from work. I had started dinner already, the rhythmic chop of vegetables on the cutting board a welcome excuse not to meet his gaze too long. He came up behind me in the kitchen, wrapped his arms around my waist, kissed the back of my neck. The gesture was familiar, gentle, the kind of affection we'd always shared. But my body tensed beneath his touch. I felt him hesitate, then let go. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. I forced a smile, turning toward him, reaching up to press my fingers lightly against his cheek. "Just tired." The words tasted like ash in my mouth. That night, after dinner, after the dishes had been washed and put away, after the television had been turned off and the lights clicked down to low, I stood alone by the window in our bedroom, staring out at the dark. I waited. I listened. And when my phone buzzed quietly on the nightstand, my heart leapt before I even reached for it. One message. "Tomorrow, your garden. 2:00. No signature. None needed. I didn't respond, but I didn't delete it either. Instead, I crawled beneath the sheets beside my husband, curled into the familiar shape of his body, and stared at the shadows on the ceiling long after he had fallen asleep. I knew I would be there. The hours leading up to 2:00 moved with cruel precision, each minute ticking past slower than the last, deliberate in its pacing as if the universe itself knew what I was about to allow. I cleaned the house more than it needed, rearranged a vase of flowers twice, smoothed the same pillow on the couch over and over with fingers that felt foreign to me, clumsy, too aware of themselves. The garden looked exactly as it always did. The same rows of roses along the fence line, the same worn bench beneath the maple, the same trellis still waiting for the last repairs he'd promised to finish. But nothing about it felt familiar that day. The air itself seemed different. Thicker, heavier, charged with the weight of anticipation. I dressed carefully without meaning to, or maybe with every bit of intention I tried so hard to deny. A soft blouse, loose enough to feel casual, but thin enough that the shape of my body beneath it wouldn't be mistaken. Jeans that fit too well to be accidental. No makeup, only the faint gloss of balm on my lips. A touch of mascara because I couldn't help myself. And beneath it all, the same black lace I had chosen before. The small rebellion against the role I was supposed to play. I watched the clock more than I should have. Told myself I wasn't waiting. But when the minute hand crossed the 12 and the soft sound of the back gate creaked open, my body betrayed me entirely. My breath caught before I could stop it, my fingers tightening around the dish towel I still held as though it could anchor me to the person I had been an hour ago. When I stepped outside, he was already there. Tool bag in one hand, casual as always, but his eyes gave him away. They found me immediately, held me there in place without a word, tracing over the line of my neck, the curve of my shoulder, the slight tremble in my hands I couldn't quite disguise. Neither of us spoke at first. The air between us filled the space where words should have been. He set the tools down near the trellis, his movements unhurried, as though this were any other visit, any other task. But I felt it. Felt the deliberate pause in the way his hands lingered over the hammer, the way his gaze didn't stray even as he knelt down to begin the work. I could feel the restraint rolling off of him, held tightly beneath the calm surface, and it mirrored the way my own skin felt stretched too thin, every nerve awake and waiting. I moved to sit on the bench, my legs crossed, hands folded in my lap. Watching him, pretending it was nothing. For long minutes, the only sound was the soft clink of metal against wood, the rustle of wind moving through the leaves above us. I traced the lines of his arms with my eyes, the way the muscles shifted beneath his skin, the curve of his back as he leaned into the task. Every movement familiar, every detail now loaded with memory. When he finally stood and turned toward me, wiping his hands on the side of his jeans, the space between us felt unbearable. "You're not going to say anything?" His voice was quieter than usual, but steady. I looked up at him, meeting his eyes without flinching. "What should I say?" His gaze softened then, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "I don't know. That you've been thinking about me as much as I've been thinking about you." The truth of it hung there between us, exposed. I stood then, too quickly, the sudden need to move overtaking my body before my mind could catch up. I walked toward the roses, my hand reaching out to touch one of the blooms, my fingers grazing the soft petals as though they could distract me. But I felt him step closer behind me, felt the shift in the air as he closed the distance. When his hand brushed lightly against the small of my back, I didn't move away. I couldn't. "You're shaking," he said softly. I closed my eyes, steadying my breath. I know. There was a long pause. The kind of silence that feels like standing on the edge of something high. The drop beneath you calling louder than reason. "You know what I want," he continued. His hand traced up along my spine. Slow, deliberate. Fingers just grazing the fabric of my blouse. His breath was close enough to stir the loose strands of hair against my neck. "And I know you want it too." I turned then, unable to hold the weight of the tension between us any longer. My body moved before my thoughts could stop it, my hand reaching up to press flat against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath my palm. "We can't," I whispered, though the words sounded weak even to my own ears. "But we will," he answered, his voice sure, his eyes locked on mine. The kiss, when it came, was not accidental this time. It wasn't rushed or impulsive. It was deliberate, certain, the culmination of every stolen glance, every word left unsaid. His lips found mine with a hunger that was barely contained, and this time I didn't hesitate. I didn't flinch. I leaned into him fully, my fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer until the space between us disappeared entirely. His hands framed my face, holding me there, grounding me in the heat of the moment as my body melted into his. There was no struggle this time, no resistance. Only want. Only the slow, dangerous unraveling of everything I had spent years trying to hold together. When we finally parted, our breath ragged between us, he didn't let go of me right away. His forehead rested against mine, his eyes still closed, as if neither of us could bear to open them and face the world outside the cocoon we had created. "I don't want to stop," he murmured. And neither did I. But the sound of a car door slamming down the street jolted us both back into place, the real world pushing its way into the fantasy we had built in the garden's quiet corners. He stepped back first, his hands falling away, his gaze still fixed on mine. "I'll finish the trellis later," he said quietly, his voice steadier than I expected. I nodded, my throat too tight to trust my voice. As he gathered his tools and walked away, I stood frozen among the roses, my lips still tingling, my heart pounding too loud against my ribs. It was done. There was no going back now. There's a particular cruelty in how normal life insists on continuing even as your world tilts beneath your feet. Morning still comes. The coffee still brews. The mail still arrives in its neat stack by the door. The dog across the street still barks at the mailman like clockwork. And my husband, my sweet, steady husband, still kisses my forehead each day as he heads out, completely unaware that the woman standing in front of him is no longer the same. I moved through the motions of the next few days with an almost mechanical grace. Each step so practiced it required no thought at all. My hands knew where the dishes went, how to fold the towels, how to sweep the kitchen floor. But my mind stayed tangled in the garden, trapped in the heat of that kiss, in the shape of his body pressed against mine, in the quiet certainty of his voice whispering that we wouldn't stop. And we didn't. We didn't even try. It didn't happen right away. There were days of restraint, days where we avoided being alone in the same room, where we spoke only in the polite, measured sentences of people who knew exactly how dangerous one wrong word could be. But beneath those words, the current between us never softened. If anything, it deepened. A silent agreement neither of us had the courage or the will to challenge. Then came the weekend. My husband suggested a short trip out of town, a work commitment he couldn't avoid, a night away. I smiled and told him to go, assured him that I'd be fine holding down the fort, that I might use the quiet time to catch up on reading, or maybe clean out the closets like I'd been meaning to for months. He kissed my cheek, thanked me for understanding, and promised to be back before dinner the next day. I watched him pack his bag, watched him fold his shirts with care, tuck his toothbrush neatly into its case. Watched him move through the habits of a life we had built together, and I hated myself in that moment more than I ever had, but not enough to stop what I knew was coming. The minute his car pulled away from the driveway, my body betrayed me entirely. My fingers shook as I reached for my phone, typing out the message with a kind of breathless urgency I couldn't control. "He's gone. I'm here." The reply came within seconds. "On my way." It was reckless, stupid, more dangerous than anything we had done before. But the risk only fed the hunger, stoked the fire already burning at the core of me. I didn't wait inside. I couldn't. I stood by the window, watching the street, feeling my pulse hammering beneath my skin like a warning I had no intention of heeding. When I saw him approach, that same easy stride, that same casual air wrapped tight around something so much darker, I felt my knees weaken beneath me. He didn't knock. He walked through the back gate like he had every right to, like he belonged there. And maybe in some awful, undeniable way, he did. When I stepped outside to meet him, the air between us thickened immediately. Neither of us spoke. There was no need. Every word that could have been said was already alive in the space between us, vibrating with the tension we hadn't dared release until now. He reached for me first, his hand sliding behind my neck, fingers tangling into my hair as he pulled me toward him. The kiss was fierce this time, urgent, no longer asking for permission. And I gave him none. I met him with equal force, my hands grasping at his shirt, dragging him closer, hungry for the feel of him, for the taste of the choice I was making with every breath. There was nothing gentle about it now. No hesitation, no pretense of restraint. Only the raw, undeniable pull of bodies that had been waiting too long, wanting too much. We didn't speak as he guided me back into the house, his hands firm at my waist, his eyes locked on mine like a dare. I led him through the kitchen, past the untouched coffee mugs still sitting by the sink, the quiet witnesses to the disaster I was inviting inside my walls. In the living room, beneath the soft afternoon light pouring in through the windows, we stood pressed together, breathless, the space between words overtaken by the language of hands, of mouths, of skin against skin. His fingers slid beneath the hem of my blouse, tracing the bare line of my back, sending shivers through me so intense I thought I might collapse under the weight of them. Every kiss, every touch, felt like it was branding me, marking me in ways that no one else could see but that I would never be able to scrub away. I didn't want to scrub it away. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt awake inside my own body. But even in that rush of heat and want, the guilt never left me. It sat there beneath the surface, coiling tighter with each breath, a snake waiting patiently, knowing it would have its moment. Because the thing about crossing a line is that once you're on the other side, you can never unsee the place where you came from. You can never forget the shape of the border you chose to step over. When it was done, when our breathing finally slowed, when our hands stopped reaching for more, we sat in the quiet, the weight of what we'd done settling heavy between us. He looked at me then, softer than I expected, his hand brushing lightly against my thigh. "This isn't the end," he said. And I knew he was right. But what neither of us knew then, what I could feel rising like a tide beneath the surface, was that the beginning of something always means the end of something else. And that ending was already on its way.